So, I was talking with my friend Zach the other day, link to his channel in the description, and we got on to the topic of affordable graphics cards, more specifically $50 GPUs, and he made the argument that the GT 730 is probably one of the best all-around GPUs for that price point. However, I thought a little bit differently, but before our discussion devolved, we thought it would be best to settle this in a graphics card showdown. For the showdown, points will be awarded to the winner of each category or test, and the card with the most overall points will be crowned the winner. The categories that we will be testing will be power consumption and size, noise and reliability, and finally, availability. Then, in addition, we will be testing 5 games to see how the two cards perform versus one another. Now I'm going to hand it off to Zach, and he's going to explain why the GT 730 is the smart $50 GPU choice.
First off, thanks for having me, Pat. The GT 730 is a great option for people who aren't into the buying used parts game like you are. The GT 730 for just $50 is a decent GPU, but most importantly, you're buying it with a warranty and not from some shady guy who could sell you a broken card.
Now for my card. I thought that for the $50 price point, buying used would be the best option. So I went with the affordably priced GTX 560 Ti. The GTX 560 Ti's tend to sell around the $50 price point. If you are lucky or patient, you can often find them for quite a bit cheaper, but if you're always in a rush like me, you'll still be able to find them at that price point. I know it may not be the newest or most practical, but it should, in most titles, be faster than the GT 730. And as far as stats go, this particular GTX 560 Ti is the 384 core variant, meaning it has the exact same amount of cores as the GK208 GT 730. However, the cores are clocked at a blistering 1700 MHz with 2 GB of GDDR5. Now, with that out of the way, let's get on to the showdown.
The first category we're testing is power consumption, and as you could expect, the GT 730 won by a landslide. With a TDP of only 25 watts, you can pretty much put this card in any system without upgrading your power supply. The GTX 560 requires extra power connectors from a PSU, as well as having a TDP of 175 watts.
The next category we are testing is size, and as far as size goes, the winner again has to be the GT 730. With it being a short single slot low profile card, this is the clear winner as it can fit into most cases out there on the market. The GTX 560 Ti, although not as large as a modern graphics card, does still take up 2 slots and isn't low profile.
Next up, our next category we're testing is noise. Although both cards stay relatively quiet, the GT 730 has to be the winner once again. The GTX 560 Ti did get a little bit loud at times, and the GT 730 stayed quiet throughout.
As for reliability and availability, the point will have to go to the GT 730 yet again. The GT 730 is available new in both big box stores and e-retailers. And being new, it usually comes with a warranty and is relatively reliable, whereas the GTX 560 Ti is very dependent on the used markets and the sellers. Although I personally love shopping used, I know it's not for everybody. As of right now, the GT 730 has a commanding lead with 4 points and the GTX 560 Ti having 0. However, now let's get on to the gaming benchmarks. After all, that's the whole reason you buy a GPU. And the first game that we will be testing is Grand Theft Auto 5.
GTA 5 is where I started to see my GT 730 take a dive. In 1080p and low settings, the GTX 560 Ti was definitely the clear winner here, averaging 103 frames per second and only dropping down to 68. The GT 730 only managed an average of 53 and dropping down to 37.
Doom was light years faster on the GTX 560 Ti. With an average of over 50 FPS, it was nearly 10 times faster on average than the GT 730. With a minimum frame rate that never dipped below 36, it would have been a very smooth gaming experience with VSync enabled. The GT 730 really isn't meant for gaming at these settings, and the frame rate shows. With a maximum frame rate that was 3 times lower than the GTX 560 Ti's low, it's almost embarrassing. If you do play this game, you'd have to drop the settings to minimum at 720p to get a playable gaming experience. With that said, let's move on to our next title, The Witcher 3.
Next up, we tested The Witcher 3 in 1080p and low, and here you can also tell how far ahead Pat's card is over mine. His 560 Ti averaged 35 frames per second, dipping down to 28, while my GT 730 only averaged 14 FPS, aka unplayable.
In CSGO, both cards had very smooth and playable results. The GT 730 would be perfectly fine for a 60Hz monitor, whereas the GTX 560 Ti would have felt right at home on a 144Hz monitor. Although CSGO is one of those weird games where the latency is tied to the frame rate, both cards would have been adequate. However, those looking for a competitive edge would still want to go with the GTX 560 Ti. The maximum frame rates were very similar, however again the 560 Ti had over double the average frame rate and slightly under double the minimum frame rate of the GT 730. Now, on to Overwatch.
And finally, the last game that we benchmarked was none other than Overwatch. We ran it in 1080p on low settings and locked the render scale to 100%. My GT 730 only managed to crank out 35 frames per second with a minimum of 26, while Pat's 560 Ti cranked out an impressive 89 FPS with a minimum of 70. I got smoked.
The Star Wars Battlefront benchmarks were pretty interesting, not because the 560 Ti walked away with a win, but rather due to how small the range between the minimum and maximum frame rates were. As much as people like to make fun of and hate Battlefront, it is an incredibly optimized game, and the frame rate range shows it. That being said, the 730 isn't playable at these particular settings, and would require a drop in resolution to play, whereas the GTX 560 Ti happily chugs along at these settings. So, after we tallied up all of the points, the GTX 560 Ti wins thanks to its far superior gaming performance. That being said, the GT 730 is the clear better card when it comes to practicality and availability. However, when it comes to gaming, the GTX 560 Ti was the clear better choice. So it all really depends on what you're looking for in a $50 graphics card. If it's only performance, you might want to take a look at the GTX 560 Ti. If you want something that is more practical, easy to get a hold of, and reliable, you may want to take a look at the GT 730. And thank you, Zach, for joining me on this episode. If you like newer tech type stuff, not my sort of thing, feel free to head on over to his channel. He's got a lot of great stuff on there. So, as always, thank you folks for watching. May your frame rates be high and your prices low. and I'll catch you folks next time.